I wanted to do something special for Spooktober, so with 4 weeks until the month ends, I just need to watch 9 Halloween specials a week to have watched all of them in time for Halloween. But then I thought, why just watch them? Why not tell you about them here on my YouTube channel where I talk about media, instead of just telling you that I'm about to watch them and leaving? That would be weird. In fact, more than just watching them, I'm going to rank every single one, which would sound really impressive if there weren't lunatics out there who have already ranked every single Simpsons episode full stop. Well, I'm going to rank 36 of them and that's all you're getting, at least until November 5th when I rank all their Guy Fawkes themed specials. Anyway, 36 may not seem like a lot, but right now it feels pretty daunting, so let's all climb our rope ladders and spend a night in the Treehouse of Horror. So we'll start with Bad Dream House, which is actually very short, and I don't have that much to say about it, so I'll take this moment to talk you through my key considerations. The first thing I'm interested in is whether these segments are scary. I don't say this because I expect them to be scary, quite the opposite. Most of them aren't, and this one definitely wasn't even when I was a kid. With that said, if it is scary, that's notable and worth saying right away. The second consideration is whether the segment functions well as a parody. Obviously, it might not always be parodying anything, and I may not have always seen what it's parodying, and I'm not going to watch a whole film or even TV show just to review a 5-minute animated short. This segment appears to be a parody of Poltergeist and of haunted houses in general. I can't really say it parodies that much, except for when Lisa directly questions the motivation of the spirit and implies that it has intimacy issues or something. Also, the idea of there being a still intact Indian burial ground is obviously an absurdist twist on the trope, and it's quite funny how Homer is super angry at the guy who sold it to them when it turns out he mentioned this several times.
He says he mentioned it 5 or 6 times.
I guess this leads to the final big consideration of humour. This wasn't hilarious, but I do like the bit where the house is speaking to Bart and telling him to kill everyone, and Bart's first assumption is that the voice is his conscience. Something hilariously dark about that. And then, after those 3 considerations, I'll get into more miscellaneous thoughts. In this case, I'd say it's nice how Marge's characterization as the moral centre of the family is reinforced. But overall, this is a pretty basic segment that is, to be fair, quite a nice generic introduction to the idea of the Simpsons in a horror setting, so in that context it works very well. I'm torn about how to rank this. I'm not sure whether to say it's the worst segment so far or the best. Fortunately, this is the only time when I can say that it's both. The next segment is called Gaslit Are the Damned. Sorry, that's Hungry Are the Damned. This episode is even less scary than the previous one because obviously it's more sci-fi than horror. Indeed, if the first episode did a good job at introducing one basic horror trope in the form of a malevolent spirit, this one functions to introduce the prospect of more corporeal threats. Although it turns out they aren't threats at all. This is a parody of that one Twilight Zone segment, and the basic twist is just that, well, turns out that they weren't going to eat them. I joked about this being gaslighting because they really do make it seem early on so much like they're planning to eat them. The stupidness of this ambiguity is actually pretty great. That book just had so much damn space dust on it. I think this segment is actually quite funny with, if you'll pardon the expression, how down to earth the aliens are. Like they can't access HBO because that would cost extra. I don't know why, but I've always liked this segment. I think it's just the feeling of it. All the weird, eerie lighting just leaves an impression. Also, I think being eaten is one of the earliest horrific notions with which kids are acquainted. So many ancient folk stories are about witches who eat children. Playing into that really stuck with me as a kid. Overall, I'm still not really struggling with the rankings in saying this segment is better than Bad Dream House. And next, capping off the first special, we have The Raven. This is honestly so good. It's not scary at all, of course. I don't know what Homer was so scared of, but it is pretty clever that they make the final segment be centered around Homer as the victimized party, since at the end of the episode, he's the most scared. I don't even know if I can call this a parody of The Raven, since it's so respectful of the poem and seems, if anything, committed to elevating it. I mean, having James Earl Jones read anything is a guaranteed way to elevate it. Now, some of the humor does come from Bart's negative comments throughout. I don't find these very funny, but I guess they're necessary because Bart definitely wouldn't sit there quietly and listen to a poem. And when he says eat my shorts instead of nevermore, it makes me laugh every time. There's also an inherent comedy in the voice performance from Dan Castellaneta and the way Homer is animated, but the real triumph of this segment is just the animation in general. I'd credit every segment so far with having a unique feel to it, but this one has the greatest Halloween energy and works so well with the source material. I like the segment so much that I'm still not having any trouble with my rankings and would place this comfortably in the top spot, and that's the first Treehouse of Horror special done. The monkey's paw really isn't that scary. It's funny that these dream sequences are punctuated by the dreamer being so scared that they can't sleep anymore, when this dream isn't even scary at all. I assume it's a parody of a specific piece of media, but this idea of a wish that backfires is so common I'm not treating it as a parody of something in particular. One reason it's not scary is because it's actually really funny. The jokes are really rapid fire since this is almost an anthology within an anthology. Each wish is its own little vignette. The two big ones are The Simpsons being famous, which functions partially as a commentary on the fame of the actual show, but my big highlight is the world peace section. Not only is it nice as a British person to see an Argentinian who isn't completely delusional,
we kind of knew they were yours,
but the arrival of the aliens is great. The fact that they have such primitive weaponry is so hilarious to me, and the way at the end they imagine boards with nails in it as the height of destructive power is just so stupid in the best possible way. And then the icing on the cake is Ned finding that the monkey's paw works great for him. Homer just can't win. Overall, the main positive here is the humour, but I'm still going to rank this one below the Raven. The Bart Zone also isn't scary. So much so, I think it's supposed to be funny that Bart wakes up screaming from a dream that ends with him hugging his dad. The concept obviously is scary. The original premise from the Twilight Zone is really that makes you think kind of horror. But this segment ultimately just uses the idea to make jokes, and honestly, it's absolutely hilarious. There's so much brilliant absurdist comedy.
The ball is turning into a fat bald guy.
I don't even think I need to labor this point. Every second something hilarious is happening. Also, they touch on some typical family dynamics with Homer and Bart, but not in some deep way obviously, and even then they still get jokes out of it. And these jokes really are the ultimate strength of the episode. I'm realizing my current pace will see this video taking ages, so forgive me if I speed things up and rush to the ranking more often, but I'm actually putting this one in the top spot, because it really is absolutely hilarious. And with the final segment, we're 2 down in terms of episodes. This is easily the scariest of the 3, especially if we're including the bit after Homer wakes up and discovers Mr. Burns still attached to him. That idea of having someone else's consciousness attached to your body is genuinely terrifying. As a parody of Frankenstein, it really just takes the core premise and does something else with it, and indeed what it ends up doing is hilarious for one simple reason. The Mr. Burns-Smithers dynamic always is. Just seeing these two interact is enough to make any episode or segment great in my view. I also enjoy some classic Mr. Burns insane incompetence, like the spirit is not willing.
His spirit was willing, but the flesh was weak.
His main beef is that his workers are incompetent, so if you put their brains in a metal body, you won't solve anything. But again, to me, that's funny. Every single ridiculous thing he does is funny. Still, I think I'll place this below the Raven because what happens really is very basic, and the main positive is the Smithers-Burns interaction stuff, which isn't unique to Treehouse of Horror, so you could argue it doesn't make the most of the horror concept. Clown without pity isn't scary. I need to stop opening these that way or else it's going to get old. In fact, I think I'll start to mix up the format so things don't get repetitive, but yeah, it absolutely isn't scary at all. This episode appears to be based on several different things and is really just riffing on the concept of a killer doll, and to be fair, it has some really funny moments. The "that's bad, that's good" exchange is one of the best iconic comedic exchanges in all of The Simpsons, and possibly the all-time greatest in the Halloween specials. And in general, a wacky premise begets comedy. It is kind of weird that this episode becomes entirely about Homer and not about Bart at all when it's his doll. We're decidedly at the point where ranking these is becoming unenviable, because there's a lot to like here. But there's also a slight negative in the way the segment runs out of steam by the end in a way that doesn't leave a lasting impression. It starts off a lot stronger. If it weren't for the gift shop scene, I'd rate this below Hungry Are the Damned, but that scene alone elevates this 2 whole places to be above the monkey's paw segment. Next we have King Homer. I don't know what this is supposed to be a parody of, but I hope it's not a horror, because this isn't scary at all. It is, however, very funny. It also features another one of my favourite lines from Treehouse of Horror.
I wish we were going to Candy Apple Island.
Candy Apple Island? What do they got there?
Apes, but they're not so big.
I'll be feeling like a broken record if I just keep saying that these segments are good because they're funny, and I'm almost looking forward to when the episodes start to get worse or at least scarier. It's sort of funny that last episode each segment ended with the characters waking up scared, but this episode each segment ends with a love heart. It shows they aren't even trying to be scary. Anyway, there's a good dose of Smithers and Burns, which is always a plus, and you can again tell we were in the era of Homer taking over Bart as the central Simpsons character because he's the big focus once more. In terms of rating, I'm struggling not to let the monotony of how similar these segments are lead me to ranking them lower and lower simply out of boredom. And taking this as its own thing, it is good, but I think it is arguably so silly that it begins to lack focus. I think I'll say this one is worse than Hungry Are the Damned. Did somebody say these segments aren't scary? Because I'm happy to report that Dial Z for Zombies is the scariest episode yet, and I guess since I'm tired of saying these segments are funny but not that scary, I'll lean into that. Firstly, this is a weird thing, but I always remember the library scene because I went through a phase of being really scared of walking alone in my school, and I realized how creepy actually being in that library at night would be. Conversely, I actually remember not finding zombies scary when I first watched this as a kid, and then when I watched my first zombie movie, it was a rude awakening to realize that a zombie apocalypse would mean having to kill your loved ones or else they would eat you alive, an undeniably horrible way to die, and I was still pretty young at the time. So yeah, ultimately this is a parody of zombie movies in general, and it has some fun with the concept, not presenting them as that scary. I don't know if it really mocks any common zombie tropes, but it does make the classic joke about someone being safe from zombies because they've got no brain. Considering zombies eating brains only became established 7 years prior with Return of the Living Dead, maybe they were the first ones to make this joke, and they complete the trifecta of classic TOH quotes in this episode with the "he was a zombie" line. Overall, while I was able to spice up talking about this segment with focusing on horror more than humour, there's still the fact that this episode isn't that scary for an adult, and it is undeniably funny, and I'm stuck in a similar predicament of not really knowing where to rank it. But I'm reasonably comfortable saying between If Only I Had a Brain and Clown Without Pity. Next, we have The Devil and Homer Simpson, which somehow feels even sillier than what's been before. Definitely not scary. It's a parody of a book I've not read before, so I can't say much about that. I have seen Supernatural though, and people sell their soul in that show all the time. You can already see the impact of them cutting the narrative down in between the segments, because this feels much more leisurely in pace than the segments so far. In fact, it sort of feels like a regular Simpsons episode in terms of tone and pacing. Also, it has Lionel Hutz in it, which is a huge positive, but to me feels in some way less Halloween-y. I do enjoy this segment, but not really as a Halloween segment. Even though it has some great moments, it kind of feels incomplete. I wish I could elaborate on that. I really like the inclusion of Lionel Hutz, obviously, but I kind of feel sorry that the very first segment is stuck right at the bottom, and within the context of Treehouse of Horror, I kind of prefer Bad Dream House, so I'm putting this at the bottom. But please note, we're still decidedly in the era of classic Simpsons, and there has not been a single segment so far I consider any less than great. Not just good, great. Classic Simpsons very rarely missed. Terror at 5.5 feet is a dramatic contrast to the previous segment in that it's a lot more scary. The whole devil thing is a joke, but Bart is genuinely scared here. While it doesn't really make any jokes about the Twilight Zone episode it parodies, it does capture that same sense of terror from knowing something's going wrong and feeling like you have no power to stop it. As a kid, I did connect with Bart's sense of terrified desperation. It's also reasonably funny, although actually one of the less funny segments so far. It did make me realize further what I meant in saying a segment feels less Halloween-y. There are lines from this episode that I remembered as classic Simpsons lines without even knowing they were from Halloween episodes. So that's my minor beef really. The humour in this segment and the previous one is funny, but a lot of the humour feels quite detached from the actual horror elements. In that regard, this episode is a lot worse than the Devil one, because in this one, all my favourite jokes could easily be put in a regular Simpsons episode. I'm in a difficult situation. In some sense, this is a great Halloween segment because it's more terrifying, but in another sense, it's bad because The Simpsons is a comedy and all the comedy here feels quite detached. For the effective horror aspects though, I will rank this segment above King Homer and below Hungry Are the Damned. Okay, so I've actually done good groundwork for myself here when I say that I really like Bart Simpson's Dracula, because sure, I didn't like complaining about the two previous segments and how the humour and the horror elements didn't always work super well together for me, but this is the exact opposite. It's probably the closest I'd say we've got so far to a full-on parody of its source material. Almost every bit of comedy is intricately tied up with the plot, and of course it doesn't hurt that a lot of the comedy is centered around Mr. Burns, who is a very funny character. I wouldn't exactly say this episode is scary, but I don't really need it to be scary. I'll take well-integrated comedy over the more serious tone needed for horror. My instinct is to say this is one of the best segments so far, except I find the ending really stupid.
Happy Halloween, everybody!
Like, I don't really get the joke, it comes across as just lol so random. As such, it's the only joke so far that I found actively unfunny, and I'm not sure how much that should count against it. With a slightly better ending, I'd rank this just above The Raven or maybe even in the top spot. But I've got to review these things holistically, and with the only moment I actively dislike out of all these segments, I've got to knock it down to below its fellow Mr. Burns-centered episode of If Only I Had a Brain. So the Shinning is the best segment. Moving on. Nah, I'm kidding, I'll talk about it a bit, but I think most people already know all the positives here. Not only is this really funny, but it's funny in a way that completely lines up with the material it's parodying. Indeed, this is the most complete parody of a piece of horror media so far. It also features some Burns and Smithers, but even after they've gone, everyone's still bringing the laughs. I can't really specify anything because it's all just so great, but, well, Go Crazy probably deserves a mention.
No TV and no beer make Homer something something.
Go crazy?
Don't mind if I do!
This is also sort of scary, and the animation is really well done to create a creepy vibe at points. Ultimately, the balance between horror and humour is pretty perfect here, and that's why I'm very comfortable placing this in the number 1 spot. I'm not entirely sure if it will be dislodged at any point by a later segment, but that would take something very special. Something special like Time and Punishment. I think this episode overall is considered one of the best Simpsons episodes in general because, well, all 3 segments are great. This one is another anthology within an anthology segment. The big focus is on Ned as the ruler of the world, which is obviously incredibly funny. Ned's such an upbeat guy that him being a dictator is hilarious to imagine. And then after that, it mostly just cuts to a few quick jokes about all sorts of different futures, and every joke there is really funny. If you want a segment that brings the jokes, this has to be it, because I basically can't talk about anything else when there isn't a frame of this episode without a top tier joke. Unfortunately, this segment isn't scary at all, which has to count against it at least a little bit as a Treehouse of Horror segment. Not too much though. I'd probably rank it below The Raven and above If Only I Had a Brain. Nightmare Cafeteria doesn't have any issues with lacking scariness. This segment is literally about kids being cannibalized by authority figures. That's dark, and they lean into that quite heavily. Still, this doesn't take away from the humour too much. This isn't as funny as the other 2 segments from this episode, but it's still fairly comedic. Having Skinner as the main antagonist works really well. Since he's such an awkward person, they can have him assume the role of a villain and still be funny while doing it. They've kind of already established that precedent with all the psycho references surrounding his character. I could complain again that I find the ending stupid in a similar way to the ending of the previous episode, but at least in this case the ending isn't really part of the segment. Indeed, the ending of the segment itself is very dark with Bart and Lisa dying. I think I'll rate this just below Time and Punishment. While it is a lot scarier and that counts for a lot, I couldn't bring myself to put it above a segment that's so much funnier than it. I do like Attack of the 50-Foot Eyesores. For some reason it always reminds me of Hit and Run. Something about these giant monsters attacking the town always makes me feel like it's a problem I could solve by driving a car around and hitting some checkpoints. It's also the first segment to not be listed on Wikipedia as a parody of anything. I kind of gave up on directly acknowledging the parody aspect of these segments unless it's relevant to my assessment. In this case, my assessment is good job coming up with an original idea. Having said that, this episode is neither especially scary nor especially funny. Obviously it's silly and it is nice to have a musical conclusion to one of these segments that I actually enjoy, but I'd have to characterize this in more measured terms. There's nothing bad about it, but nothing great either. In fact, I'd probably have to place it in last place, because so far, no matter where I've ranked these segments, they've all had elements I really like. This is the first segment where I still really like it overall, but I'm struggling to gush over it in the way I've been doing up until now. I feel like I should clarify, when I say a segment is scary, I'm just saying that it has the general tone of being scary. I'm not saying that any of these segments scare me as an adult. To be honest, none of these segments even scared me as a child. None of these segments until Nightmare on Evergreen Terrace. This episode actually had me shivering with fear in bed the night I watched it. Willie's skeleton body is actually a terrifying image, as is, of course, the idea that a monster could kill you in your sleep. Yes, this is obviously parodying Nightmare on Elm Street, which has the same scary element, but I didn't watch Nightmare on Elm Street until I was an adult, and that movie is surprisingly goofy. So while there was over a decade between these two events, I did find watching the Simpsons parody scarier than the actual original horror movie, which says something. The other big positive for me about this segment is how exciting it is. When Bart goes into his dream to confront Willie and they have that showdown, I'm really invested in them actually defeating him. Most of the other segments feel kind of inconsequential and like they're not even trying to be taken seriously, but in this one you really feel like they need to defeat the threat. I haven't mentioned humour, this does have funny moments, but it does so much else well that there's not as much room for jokes. Do Not Touch Willie is obviously the big joke everyone remembers. This ranks really high for me, and I could maybe justify putting it in the top spot based on the fact it's probably the segment I enjoy most in the same way I'd enjoy other Halloween media, but since The Simpsons is a comedy, I'll factor that in a bit and rank this in second place, below the Shinning. Homega is a very interesting concept. I like when these segments use everything available to them to give these segments their own unique feeling, and no one can deny that's what we see here. The animation is the big selling point, as is seeing Homer in the real world at the end. Having said that, this episode definitely isn't scary, and it isn't that funny. Having just watched it, I couldn't tell you any joke from it that really stands out, but the unique premise does a lot of heavy lifting. I haven't seen the Twilight Zone episode this is based on, but since the Twilight Zone isn't animated, I can't imagine the original is able to be quite this creative with the premise. So we find ourselves at the big issue with any ranked list. Where do we place something that's main selling point is how unique it is? By what metric can we evaluate it relative to the others? I think just below Nightmare Cafeteria makes a lot of sense. I don't want to rank it above the episodes with really great Halloween energy, but its originality has to see it placed pretty high. So these episodes are 2 for 2 in terms of scary segments because The Thing and I absolutely terrified me to my core. I still remember when I first watched it, I was at my grandparents' and being in an unfamiliar house made me very scared of their attic. Significantly, this is one of the only segments so far that doesn't feature a supernatural element, and as such feels like it really could happen. A crazy person being locked up in your attic? Not nice. And then when Bart locks all the doors to the house only to realize that Hugo is still in the house with him? Does anyone disagree this is the scariest segment? The twist that Bart is the evil twin is actually pretty great. As Bart points out himself, it's not exactly surprising considering all the bad things he does. Still, I've always found that final scene of him now locked up in the attic being treated like an animal to be a weirdly dark ending. I almost feel like there's some philosophical point about nature and nurture's relationship to evil here, but we've got to move on. I'll just say that this episode isn't very funny. I do enjoy Dr. Hibbert as a quack doctor, but humour isn't the strong point. Scariness is though, and that has to count for something in the rankings. Based on that, I'm putting this just above the not as scary Nightmare Cafeteria, but below the much more funny Time and Punishment. The Genesis Tub is a fun segment. It's not massively funny. In fact, I'm struggling to think of any super great jokes from it having just watched it. It's also not super scary, but it is a fun idea. I have a surprisingly small amount to say. Fittingly, it's a very small story. It's really just about Lisa and Bart, and aside from that, there's this tiny town filled mostly with people we've never seen before. In fact, I assume this must be one of the shortest segments because I can't remember much that happens in it. So yeah, I don't dislike the segment. In fact, if I was ranking based on time efficiency, I'd maybe rank it higher, but I'm generally ranking on how many things I have to praise. And in this case, I don't have much that I can praise at all. Not that scary, not that funny, kind of an interesting premise, obviously a premise taken from the Twilight Zone. So I'm going to, respectfully, with peace and love, rank this at the bottom. Well, how about that upcoming election?
It might be, what's his name, Mumbly Joe.
It definitely won't be Mumbly Joe. It is rather funny that the American election is always so close to Halloween, and in this segment they focus a lot more on political satire than anything particularly scary. Obviously the main joke is how cynical the US two-party system is, with the complete impossibility of voting for a better candidate. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump seem pretty different to me, but in the UK last summer we actually voted for an evil space alien dedicated to destroying this country who only got in because he was up against another space alien, so I can relate. I was one of those idiots who threw away my precious vote by voting for a minor party. The other aspect to the humour is just how awkward these aliens are in pretending to be humans and the absurdism that nobody recognises something is wrong. That's Slick Willy for you. Overall though, this feels like the first time in a while that I'm saying the comedy is really front and center, and there are a lot of funny lines here that I can immediately remember. The issue is, in my ranking there's a whole load of really funny episodes in the middle that are separated by a hair's breadth. So with the disclaimer that this is kind of arbitrary, I'm going to separate the two segments from season 3 and place this between Dial Z for Zombie and Clown Without Pity. Next we have the Homega Man, a parody of the Omega Man, where Homer is the last person alive. I feel like this segment is really well divided into distinct parts. It starts off with the Bart's Comet adjacent plot about the threat of a French nuclear strike and all the political comedy around that. Then you see Homer enjoying his life as the last man alive with no responsibility. It's only at this point it transitions to being overtly Halloweeny, with the mutants showing up and attacking him, and then there's the twist at the end with the humans being the intolerant bad guys. Viewing this as another zombie story alongside Dial Z for Zombie, it's interesting to see the contrast. Obviously this leans more into the post-apocalypse aspect rather than the immediate aftermath of a nascent violent horde, and honestly I sort of prefer that. I like the variety to this segment and the way it covers aspects of the zombie apocalypse generally not explored. And yes, I realize they're mutants, but in my view mutants are basically zombies. With this said, I'd rank it above if I only had a brain, but below Homerd. Fly vs. Fly is quite funny. I mean, Professor Frink is a really funny character. Easily the funniest part is the way Marge and Homer completely accept Bart as this hideous half-fly monster, but at the same time, this episode is also really gross. I was never scared by this episode, but this is definitely a time I'm glad the show is quite basic with its animation, because knowing what a fly actually looks like, the idea of a real human being with a fly's head is so gross to me. I haven't seen the original Fly, even though I probably should. I'm sure it's good, but I imagine that's even more gross. But with this fly already being unpleasant enough just when it's hanging around eating sugar, it does make it genuinely terrifying when it actually starts attacking Lisa. I'm getting real tired of rating these segments relative to each other when they're all really good, but I think I'll say that this falls between Clown Without Pity and Monkey's Paw. It's definitely solid, but I can't say it really stands out. Easy Bake Coven is not scary. Remember at the start of the video where I implied I'd mention that to begin every segment? But it is obviously very Halloween themed in a way that I really like. It's literally about how Halloween developed, albeit obviously inaccurately so. But I think this directness regarding Halloween is to be appreciated. This episode is also one of the funnier segments in a while. I never thought of the Salem witch trials as a great source of comedy, but seeing them directly tackle the stupidity of it all is pretty funny. Indeed, while the segment doesn't parallel any specific media, it parodies this era of history very well. Also, this is the first appearance of witches, which are quite significant to Halloween. There are a few other jokes that make this one of the more humorous segments around this era of the show, and with this said, I'm ranking this below The Thing and I, but above Nightmare Cafeteria. So, in this first quarter we've officially cleared the entire classic era of the show, and we still have 3 more parts to go. But honestly, I'm so ready for that because I've got pretty tired of saying that every single one of these segments is just varying shades of pretty great. Annoyingly, I might have to be tired a little bit longer because I think The Simpsons still stayed pretty great until the end of season 16, and the Treehouse of Horror episodes remained highlights of the show even beyond that. So, Hell to Pay is still pretty great. The humour is in keeping with how it's been for the past few seasons, quite funny but not as reliably laugh out loud as most of the segments from the first half of this video. I do like the first appearance of Dr. Nick in one of these as a wacky character. The concept itself is good even though I believe it's lifted directly from the work it's parodying. Even the title is the same. The gruesome murders are entertaining considering we haven't really seen anything like that so far. It's interesting that this episode features a wholesome family dynamic. Homer chooses to fight the power of the hair to save his son's life in the end. Considering that plenty of these segments have involved at least one of the Simpsons family trying to kill the others, it's cute to see them all get along. Overall, I'm still going to rank this kind of low, between the Devil and Homer Simpson and Attack of the 50-Foot Eyesores, but I'm anxiously awaiting the point where I can definitively say, this segment is easily the bottom in terms of ranking due to the overall decline of the show. The Terror of Tiny Toon is a really fun concept. We've seen Itchy and Scratchy so many times before that Bart and Lisa entering this world that we know is horrendously violent feels overdue for Treehouse of Horror. Honestly, they could have got even more out of them jumping around TV channels, but having said that, there's nothing I particularly want to cut. I like the way they navigate the cartoon logic, and it feels as such like there are real stakes. We know they could die in the same way that Itchy and Scratchy die, but that also things will be a bit sillier in terms of what can happen. It is, to be fair, not very funny. I mostly like the beginning with Homer as a hobo, and the very end where Scratchy is told he has to be neutered, but apart from that, it's not hilarious. Anyway, let's say just above King Homer. I really wanted to close this by saying that Starship Troopers was comfortably worse than all the other segments, but honestly, it's not that bad. I mean, it isn't scary, but it is pretty funny. There are some good moments here. I expected the Jerry Springer thing to be super dumb, but honestly, I kind of liked it. The way that they reduced this issue down to a trashy reality TV drama. Also, it's nice to see Marge swear for once. The fact this episode is about Maggie gains it some bonus points because obviously Maggie is really cute. I mean, the episode definitely doesn't feel very Halloween-y, but it's still fun. On balance, I can probably rank it last so far, but the fact I can say that without even having to argue it's particularly bad and actually it's a lot of fun and entirely enjoyable speaks to that none of these segments so far have been bad. Indeed, we've reached the end of the first quarter and I have nothing but overall positive things to say, which is kind of impressive in a way, that this show was so consistently good. Hope it didn't make for a boring video though. Also, it goes without saying that with me having stressed so many times that all these segments are good, there's not really much point in complaining about the specific order in which I rank them, since I'm saying I like all of them, but if you do comment then that will help in the algorithm, so complain if you like. My prediction is that the ranking that will annoy most people is how low I ranked The Devil and Homer Simpson, because people like Lionel Hutz. Oh well, I stand by my decision. Anyway, make sure to subscribe and click here to check out part 2 if it's out by now. I'll see you all next week. Bye!